They keep saying this is about stopping Iran, but look closer, and it starts to look like a war that is teaching the whole world how fragile the modern economy really is. So here's the question that matters. If nobody truly wants a regional apocalypse, why does every move in this war make that apocalypse more likely? By day 11, this conflict had already outgrown the language people used to describe it in week 1. It was no longer just a series of retaliatory strikes, no longer just another violent exchange between Israel, the United States, and the Islamic Republic. It had become something wider, darker, and far more dangerous: a systems war. Missiles were still the most visible part of it, yes, but missiles were only the surface. Beneath them sat energy choke points, proxy networks, domestic political survival, maritime intimidation, prestige, deterrence theater, and one brutal truth that almost never gets stated plainly enough. Modern wars are no longer fought only to destroy armies. They are fought to crash assumptions. The assumption that oil will keep flowing. The assumption that shipping lanes remain neutral. The assumption that air defenses can cover everything. The assumption that world powers can calibrate force like engineers turning dials. Inside Iran's escalation, the core idea is brutally simple. If Tehran cannot dominate the battlefield, it can make the battlefield indistinguishable from the global marketplace. That is why this war feels so unnerving. It does not move in a straight line. It expands sideways. Iran fires missile barrages into Israel, then activates pressure against Gulf infrastructure, then threatens shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, then amplifies the role of Hezbollah and aligned forces, then absorbs retaliatory strikes and keeps going. In just under 2 weeks, roughly 300 missiles were launched at Israel, with concentrated barrages hammering psychological pressure as much as military targets. The UAE was hit, Bahrain was hit, Saudi energy sites came under threat, commercial vessels in and around the Gulf were struck in rapid succession, Brent crude surged past $100 a barrel, despite an emergency release of 400 million barrels from strategic reserves, an extraordinary intervention that would normally calm a panicked market. This time, it didn't. That failure tells you something profound. Traders are not pricing in a temporary disruption. They are pricing in fear of structural rupture. And here is the surprising fact most people miss because the headlines move too fast. The most powerful Iranian weapon in this war may not be the missile that lands, but the insurance premium that gets recalculated. Not the tanker that sinks, but the tanker that never sails. Not the oil that disappears, but the expectation that it might. That is the invisible battlefield: perception, risk, hesitation. Once ship owners, insurers, refiners, governments, and commodity traders begin acting as if the Strait of Hormuz is no longer reliably open, Tehran has already achieved a strategic victory far larger than the cost of any one strike. The thesis of this episode is straightforward. Iran is not trying to win a conventional war against the United States and Israel. It is trying to make victory so economically, politically, and morally expensive that everyone involved starts redefining what winning even means. That is the escalation matrix. That is the real design. Start with what is actually happening. Militarily, coalition strikes have imposed costs. Reports indicate Iranian drone launch capacity has been degraded, with launch rates dropping significantly under sustained pressure. But the ballistic missile campaign has remained comparatively resilient, suggesting hardened and subterranean launch infrastructure is still functioning. That matters because it reveals the first lesson of this war. Degradation is not defeat. Washington and Jerusalem can hit launchers, bases, depots, command nodes, and still discover that enough capacity survives underground to keep the war politically alive. A state does not need perfect retaliation to preserve deterrence. It just needs enough retaliation to prove it cannot be safely punished. At the same time, Tehran has widened the map on purpose. This is not random lashing out. It is a division strategy. Force Israel to stay locked on missile defense. Force the United States to guard its own bases and naval assets. Force Gulf monarchies to confront the possibility that geographic proximity matters more than alliance rhetoric. Force global markets to react as if every new strike could become the one that closes the choke point. Iran understands that alliance cohesion weakens when the burden spreads unevenly. A missile over Tel Aviv is politically one thing. A fire at a Bahraini fuel depot, drone penetration in the UAE, and commercial hulls burning in Gulf waters are something else. Every new front creates a new constituency for restraint. Now, why does this matter? Because the war's center of gravity is not only Tehran, Tel Aviv, or Washington. It is confidence. Confidence that deterrence still works. Confidence that escalation can be controlled. Confidence that shipping can be protected. Confidence that civilian casualties do not destroy coalition legitimacy. Confidence that Gulf states will keep aligning under fire. Confidence that the United States can punish Iran without getting dragged into occupation logic. If confidence collapses, the battlefield changes faster than the order of battle. And that takes us to what most people are completely missing. The deadliest strike of the war may also be the one that most damaged the coalition's strategic position. The bombing of the Shahjareh Tayyibeh Girls' School in Manab, which killed at least 170 civilians, mostly children, was not just a tragedy, it was a rupture. According to subsequent reporting and preliminary investigation, the strike was linked to a U.S. Tomahawk missile aimed using outdated intelligence tied to a nearby IRGC naval facility. In pure military language, this gets called a targeting failure. In geopolitical language, it is something more corrosive, a legitimacy collapse event. Because once a coalition fighting in the name of security becomes associated with mass child casualties, every argument about precision, restraint, and moral superiority starts to sound hollow. This is where wars slip. Not only through battlefield losses, but through moral asymmetry. Iran does not need to persuade the world that it is innocent. It only needs to persuade enough of the world that its enemies are reckless, hypocritical, or lawless. The Manab school strike gives Tehran exactly that opening. Even if the original intent was to hit military infrastructure, intent does not resurrect dead children. And when officials first deflect, deny, or improvise blame instead of confronting the truth, the information damage compounds. One missile can kill a school. One dishonest briefing can kill credibility. The strongest opposing view says this is still fundamentally a necessary war. Iran has spent years building missile stockpiles, financing proxies, threatening shipping, destabilizing neighbors, and embedding military assets near civilian sites. In that view, the current campaign is ugly but unavoidable. If Tehran is not hit hard now, the argument goes, it will emerge emboldened, nuclear adjacent, regionally dominant, and even more dangerous later. The Gulf shipping attacks, the strikes on the UAE and Bahrain, the activation of Hezbollah, the explicit threats to shut down oil transit, all of this, supporters say, proves that force was not the cause of Iranian aggression, but the overdue response to it. That argument deserves to be taken seriously because parts of it are true. Iran has long relied on asymmetric escalation, deniability, proxy warfare, and coercive leverage through geography. It does place military value on making itself hard to punish cleanly. It does understand that the Strait of Hormuz is a pressure point for the entire world. And no responsible analysis should pretend Tehran is merely reacting passively. It is choosing escalation. It is weaponizing interdependence. It is gambling that fear of wider war will shield it from decisive retaliation. But here is where that argument breaks down. It assumes that because Iran is dangerous, military pressure automatically produces strategic control. It doesn't. In fact, this war is demonstrating the opposite. The more punishment is applied without a clear political end state, the more incentives Iran has to keep broadening the costs. If regime survival is on the line, then disruption becomes rational. If proxy credibility is in question after setbacks in Syria and elsewhere, then proxy activation becomes necessary theater. If domestic legitimacy is under strain, especially after the reported death of Ayatollah Khamenei at the outset of the conflict, then elite cohesion may depend on proving revolutionary defiance under fire. In that environment, escalation is not a policy error from Tehran's perspective, it is a survival mechanism. And survival mechanisms are notoriously hard to deter with conventional signaling. Consider the pattern. The United Nations demands a halt. Iran ignores it. Strategic reserves are released. Markets shrug. Drone and missile launch capacity is struck. Ballistic barrages continue. Gulf states condemn attacks. Their infrastructure remains exposed. None of that means deterrence has disappeared. It means deterrence is fragmented. Every actor can still impose costs, but no actor can impose closure. This is why the fear of a ground war keeps surfacing, even when almost everyone says they want to avoid one. Ground invasions rarely begin as preferred options. They emerge when air power fails to produce the political result leaders promised, when a mass casualty event hardens public pressure, when credibility becomes fused with escalation, and when leaders convince themselves that one more decisive move will restore control. President Trump's vow to finish the job and Iranian threats that the Gulf will run with the blood of invaders are not just rhetorical excess. They are public commitments that narrow future flexibility. Once leaders speak in totalizing language, backing away starts to look like surrender. And that is the hidden escalator in this war. Not simply weapon systems, but narrative lock-in. Washington cannot easily say, after all this, that limited aims were enough if Iran keeps firing and shipping keeps burning. Tehran cannot easily say that symbolic resistance was sufficient if allied strikes continue and domestic factions demand vengeance. Israel cannot tolerate endless missile normalization. Gulf monarchies cannot absorb repeated violations of airspace and infrastructure without questioning the value of their defense architecture. Every side is being pushed by its own prior statements. Now step back and look at the economic dimension, because this is where the conflict becomes global. Roughly 1/5 of the world's crude flows through the Strait of Hormuz. That statistic has been repeated so often it risks losing meaning, so let's restore it. This is not a regional side route. It is one of the beating arteries of industrial civilization. When 6 commercial vessels are struck in 48 hours, when underwater and aerial threats blur the distinction between sabotage and blockade, when insurers, shippers, and energy buyers begin recalculating exposure, you do not need a formal closure to trigger systemic panic. A de facto blockade can exist before a legal blockade is declared. The economics of fear do the rest. That is why the IEA's massive reserve release failed to calm prices. Emergency barrels can cushion supply. They cannot restore trust. And oil markets are, at their core, trust markets. Trust that cargoes depart. Trust that they arrive. Trust that transit remains insurable. Trust that military escorts, if formed, can actually guarantee passage. Once that trust erodes, price becomes a referendum on vulnerability. Asia understands this immediately because Asia cannot afford not to. From South Korea to India to Bangladesh to Thailand, governments have already begun implementing extraordinary energy-saving measures, diversion plans, and demand management responses. That reaction tells you this war has crossed from geopolitics into household economics. The person who never reads foreign policy news will still feel it in fuel, food, freight, electricity, inflation, and employment. That is how regional wars become world events. Not when maps change, but when prices change. And there is another revelation here, maybe the most uncomfortable one of all. Iran does not need to defeat American power to expose its limits. It only needs to reveal that a middle power with missiles, proxies, maritime reach, and strategic geography can hold the global economy hostage long enough to fracture consensus. That is the real message echoing beneath the explosions. The old model of overwhelming force assumes that if one side's military capabilities are superior enough, order can be restored through punishment. But what if disorder is the weapon? What if the objective is not to withstand the stronger power symmetrically, but to force that stronger power into defending everything, everywhere, all at once? Airspace, shipping lanes, bases, allies, public opinion, legality, oil prices, and escalation credibility. No superpower is infinitely scalable. That does not mean Iran is winning. It means the meaning of victory is deteriorating for everyone. Israel can intercept many incoming threats and still live under siege conditions. The United States can strike deeply and still face the accusation that it is fueling catastrophe. Gulf states can host advanced defense systems and still watch drones penetrate. Iran can proclaim resistance and still absorb serious military damage and economic pain. This is the signature of a conflict nobody can stop easily. Not because nobody has force, but because no one possesses a politically acceptable endgame. So what would the off-ramp even look like? Not peace, not in this sentimental sense. More likely a bargain so unsatisfying that every side claims partial victory and private disappointment. Maritime attacks halt in exchange for a pause in deep strikes. Secondary sanctions are loosened conditionally. Proxy fire is reduced under pressure from patrons. Investigations into civilian harm are acknowledged, maybe even paired with reparations. Gulf air defenses are integrated faster. Naval escorts are assembled not as triumph, but as damage control. In other words, de-escalation would look less like resolution than managed exhaustion. The problem is that managed exhaustion requires leaders to admit limits. And limits are exactly what wartime politics punishes. Hardliners read compromise as weakness. Families of victims read pauses as betrayal. Markets punish ambiguity. Militias thrive in gray zones. And every day the war continues, the probability rises that some single event, a successful strike on a major U.S. installation, a catastrophic mass casualty attack in Israel, a mining incident that sinks a supertanker, a major Hezbollah push from Lebanon, another large civilian massacre blamed on coalition weapons, will force decision makers into the one scenario they claim to fear most. That scenario is not merely more war. It is a conversion of this conflict from an exchange of coercive signals into a campaign of irreversible commitments. Once ground forces enter Iran at scale, the logic changes entirely. then the war is no longer about restoring deterrence or defending navigation. It becomes about regime survival, occupation fears, insurgency planning, urban warfare, and nationalist mobilization inside a country with immense geography, deep ideological institutions, and every incentive to turn invasion into attrition. Anyone speaking casually about finishing the job should be forced to answer a simple question: where exactly does that job end? In missile sites? In command centers? In Tehran? In regime collapse? In stabilization? In reconstruction? History is littered with wars launched under verbs and trapped in nouns. And still, for all that, there is a temptation among observers to treat this as inevitable, as if the region is simply replaying old scripts. That is too easy, and it lets decision makers off the hook. This war is not inevitable. It is cumulative. It is being built, strike by strike, statement by statement, miscalculation by miscalculation. The Manab school tragedy was not inevitable. The targeting process failed. The public response failed. The strategic cost was invited. The same is true at sea. A de facto blockade is not weather. It is a chosen campaign. Missile barrages are not destiny, they are decisions. The danger in calling this uncontrollable is that leaders begin behaving as though they are merely passengers inside forces they themselves keep accelerating. Here, then, is the single most powerful point of this entire episode. The war nobody can stop is not unstoppable because the weapons are too strong. It is unstoppable because every side believes stopping first would validate the other side's theory of power. Iran believes survival requires proving that punishment cannot silence it. The United States believes credibility requires proving that attacks on allies and shipping cannot go unanswered. Israel believes national survival requires proving missile coercion cannot become normal. Gulf states believe their sovereignty requires proving they are not open-air hostages to geography. Each side thinks de-escalation, if initiated unilaterally, will teach the wrong lesson. And as long as that belief holds, even rational actors will keep making irrational outcomes more likely. That is the revelation. This is not chaos replacing strategy. This is strategy producing chaos. So when you hear officials insist they are seeking deterrence, remember that deterrence is not a magic word. It is a relationship of expectations. Right now, the expectation on every side is that pain works better than restraint. And that is why the missiles keep coming, the tankers keep burning, the oil keeps climbing, and the diplomatic language keeps shrinking into threats. The battlefield is not only in Iran or Israel or the Gulf. It is inside the minds of leaders who have boxed themselves into proving they still control events. The cruelest irony is that the harder they try to prove it, the more they reveal they don't. One last thought. The most dangerous wars are not always the ones fought by leaders who want endless conflict. Sometimes they are fought by leaders who think they are just one strike away from ending it.